Namaste and welcome to Daily News Simplified, the what, why, and how of newspaper reading. Today we would be analyzing the daily edition of the Hindu newspaper of 16 June 2018. Now let us begin. Now we have taken this article from the editorial page on page 8. Now what this article talks about is how secularism evolved during the colonial period in India. But before moving forward, let us first understand as to where this article would be placed in your UPSC syllabus. The evolution of secularism in colonial India would first be a part of your GS paper 1 within the section Modern Indian History from about the middle of the 18th century till the present. And similarly, it would also be a part of society within the subsection Secularism. Now, the first aspect that the article provides is a background on how the relation between state and church was conducted in England, wherein England had no form of separation between the state and the church, and this could be seen wherein the monarch or the king or queen of England was the supreme head of the Church of England. And apart from this, high-level officials from the Church of England were also appointed to the government. Now the author has also given further examples on how there was no form of separation between the state and church in England. And according to the author, it was this similar format of no separation between state and church that was borrowed by the East India Company in India. Now the author has given several examples on how the East India Company followed the similar format as that was followed in England, wherein the colonial government in India enacted laws that the general management of all lands granted for the support of mosques and temples were vested with the colonial government. And similarly, the temple employees were also employed by the government officials. And similarly, the officials of the East India Company also made religious offerings to temples. And these aspects given by the author showcase on how the East India Company formed no form of separation between the state and church in India. However, there was a shift in the conduct of East India Company with regards to religious affairs in India, wherein according to the author, there was a shift in the relation between state and church in India that happened through the directive of 1833 given by the colonial government. Now the 1833 directive of the colonial government said that there would be a stoppage of British functionaries in the interior management of Indian temples and religious practices. And soon after this, a new law was passed in 1863. Wherein this 1863 law stated that it would not be lawful for any government of India or its officers to take general control of property belonging to religious establishment in India. And moreover, under this law, it would also not be lawful for the government of India and its officers to take part in the management of religious establishments in India. And it is through the 1833 directive and the 1863 law that became significant instances of separation of state and church in India. And the reason for these instances, wherein the colonial government in India had to bow down for separation of state and church in India, even though the separation of state and church was not a part of England at that time, was that there was pressure from Christian missionaries. Now hopefully up till here you have understood the background on how the evolution of secularism occurred in colonial India. Wherein to first understand this, you need to understand on how the relation between the state and church was conducted in England, wherein England had no form of separation between the state and church, wherein the monarch or the king or queen of England was the supreme head of Church of England, and apart from this, high-level officials from the Church of England were also appointed to the government. And apart from other instances, it shows that England had no form of separation between the state and church. And it is this similar format of no form of separation between state and church that was followed by the East India Company in India, wherein laws were enacted that the general control of all lands granted for the support of mosques and temples in India were vested with the colonial government. And in similar terms, temple employees were also employed by government officials, religious offerings were made by the officials of the East India Company to temples, among other instances that show that the East India Company had no form of separation between the state and church in India. However, a shift in this policy first came through the 1833 directive, wherein the colonial government ordered that there should be a stoppage of British functionaries in the interior management of Indian temples and religious practices. And this policy of separation of state and church in India was further augmented by the 1863 law, wherein under this law it would not be lawful for any government of India or its officers to take the general control of property belonging to religious establishment in India. And moreover, the government of India or its officer cannot also take part in the management of religious establishments in India. And it is through the 1833 directive and the 1863 law that became significant instances of separation of state and church in colonial India. And the one major reason for the shift in this policy Even though during this time there was no form of separation of state and church within England itself, was that there was pressure from Christian missionaries and clergy that there should not be any form of appeasement of other religions in India. However, there was a dilution in this policy after the enactment of the Government of India Act 1919. Now, after the enactment of the Government of India Act 1919, Indian legislators came to power in provinces, and in Madras, they enacted the Madras Hindu Religious Endowments Act of 1926, and thereby taking over the management of Hindu temples. And according to the author, this law began the instances of states' involvement in religious institutions and practices in India, whereby the Madras Hindu Religious Endowments Act of 1926 diluted the separation between the state and church that was established by the 1833 Directive and the 1863 law. And therefore, according to the author, the separation between state and church in colonial India was first constructed by the colonial government but was then diluted by the Indian leaders. So now hopefully you have understood on how the evolution of secularism occurred in colonial India. Now a simple question for your practice would be to examine the evolution of secularism in colonial India, wherein this article and the explanation given in this section would provide you an answer within the 200-250 word limit. And so now with this, we move on to the next article. Now we have taken this article from page 11. Now what this article talks about, that in 2016, India has signed an MOU or a Memorandum of Understanding with Mozambique. Now if you take a look at this map, Mozambique is a country on the east coast of Africa. And the MOU signed with Mozambique was that India would import pulses from Mozambique for 5 years. Now the reason India had to sign an MOU with Mozambique to import pulses. Now the first reason was that pulse prices in India had increased considerably in 2015 and 2016. And this higher prices of pulses began to affect consumers in India, wherein pulses such as urad dal, among other, are major sources of protein for vegetarians in India. And apart from this, Australia, which was a major exporter of pulses to India, had reduced its production, and therefore India also required another reliable import source from whom it can purchase pulses. And therefore India signed an MOU with Mozambique, where India would purchase a particular amount of pulses being harvested by Mozambique, and thereby providing food security in pulses to India. But however, due to the high domestic prices of pulses in 2016, a large number of farmers in India sowed pulses in 2017 and further in 2018 on the basis of achieving the high domestic prices that existed for pulses in 2016. However, this led to a surplus harvest of pulses in India, both in the year of 2017 and there would again be a surplus harvest later this year. And because of this surplus harvest, there was an oversupply of pulses in the Indian market, wherein this oversupply led to a significant drop in the prices of pulses in India. But as the article has shown, the central government is going to import pulses to fulfill its obligations of the MOU with Mozambique. And this decision of the central government to further import pulses has raised various concerns. The first concern raised is that the government is going to import pulses, but the international market rate of pulses is actually very high as compared to the domestic prices, wherein for example the price of tur dal in the international market is around 27,000 rupees, but the price of tur dal in the domestic market or the Indian market is roughly around 3,400 rupees. So there is a huge difference in the international market rate of pulses as compared to the domestic prices. And the second concern raised is that the import of pulses would further reduce the prices in the domestic market and thereby increasing the distress of pulse farmers in India who are going to harvest the 2018 batch of pulses soon. So now hopefully up till here you've understood the focus of this article, wherein in 2016 India has signed a Memorandum of Understanding or an MOU with the country of Mozambique. And under this MOU, India was going to import pulses from Mozambique for 5 years. However, due to the high domestic prices in pulses in 2016, a large number of farmers in India began to sow pulses in 2017 and further in 2018. And because of this, there was surplus harvest of pulses in India in 2017. And moreover, there's going to be a surplus harvest in India in pulses again in 2018. And because of this, there was an oversupply of pulses in the domestic market, and due to which there was a significant drop in the prices of pulses in India. But because the government of India had signed an MOU with Mozambique in 2016 to import pulses, the center has to fulfill that obligation. And even though there is surplus harvest in India of pulses, India is still going to import pulses from Mozambique. And this has further raised concerns wherein the prices of pulses would further reduce in the domestic market in India and thereby increasing the distress for pulse farmers who are soon going to harvest the 2018 batch of pulses. Now, with regards to your UPSC syllabus, wherein this article and the explanation given in this section would be placed in GS paper 3 in the section Economic Development within the subsection Issues of Buffer Stocks and Food Security. Now we'll have to wait and see as to what would be the government's response to reduce the distress of pulse farmers in India and still maintain its obligation of importing pulses from Mozambique. And so now with this, we move on to the next article. Now we have taken this article from page 13. Now the reason this article is in the news because the State Bank of India has said that it will stop handling Iran oil payments. And the reason the State Bank of India has said that it will stop handling Iran oil payments is because, as you might know, that after the United States withdrew from the Iranian nuclear deal, it had reimposed sanctions on Iran. And because of these sanctions, the State Bank of India does not want to trade in any currency with Iran that will impact its US operations. However, the government of India previously has said that it will not follow the US sanctions on Iran. And therefore, you have to understand that this news is currently in transition. And so we'll have to wait and see on how the government of India and the State Bank of India move forward in handling the oil payments with Iran. And so considering this, let us move on to the next article. Now we have taken this article from page 13. Now the reason this article is in the news is because India's merchandise trade deficit has increased to 14.62 billion. Now this has happened because in May of 2018, India's export were at roughly $28 billion, while India's import were roughly at $43 billion. But however, merchandise exports have increased year-on-year basis, wherein the exports in May of 2017 was around $24 billion, while the exports in May of 2018 is at around $28 billion. But now the question is, why is there an increased trade deficit, even though there has been an increase in the exports of India? And the reason for this is that there has been an increase in oil import, and also there was an increase in the price of oil. So wherein during May of 2017, the oil import bill for India was roughly around $7 billion. But in May of 2018, the import oil bill increased to roughly around $11 billion. And one of the major reasons for this huge increase was that there was a 50% increase in the global crude oil prices between May of 2017 and May of 2018. Now hopefully up to here you have understood that India's merchandise trade deficit has increased to roughly around $14 billion. But however, there has been an increase in the value of exports from India on a year-on-year basis. And the reason why there has been an increased trade deficit, even though there has been an increase in exports in India, is because of the increase in the oil import and increase in the global oil prices, wherein between May of 2017 and May of 2018, there was a 50% increase in the global crude oil prices, which led to an increased trade deficit for India, even though there has been an increase in exports from India. Now you have to understand that you do not need to remember the figures given in this article or in this section. And this article and the explanation given in this section should be considered significant with regards to a conceptual understanding of the causes of the increase in India's trade deficit. Now with regards to your UPSC syllabus, this article and the explanation given in this section would be placed in GS paper 3 in the economic development section and within the subsection government budgeting. Now a question for practice would be which of the following would increase the merchandise trade deficit in India? Now the first option is increase in the export of petroleum products and the second option is decrease in international crude oil prices. Now as you should know that the increase in the export of petroleum products would actually decrease the merchandise trade deficit, while the decrease in international crude oil prices would decrease the India's oil import bill and therefore would also decrease India's trade deficit. And therefore the correct answer would be neither 1 nor 2, wherein both of these options would not increase the merchandise trade deficit in India. And so now with this, we move on to the next article. Now we have taken this article from the editorial page on page 8. Now the article analyzes the steps that have been taken by the government of India to support the sugarcane farmers. Now what has recently happened is that the government has imposed a special cess under GST, and this cess has been imposed to reduce the distress among sugarcane farmers. but it would largely depend on how the money that is collected through the cess goes forward in aiding the sugarcane farmers. And apart from this, the Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs has also approved a 7,000 crore package for the sugar sector. Now, the 7,000 crore package approved by the Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs has proposed assured minimum pricing for sugarcane. And apart from this, it also gives special incentives, such as increasing the molasses and ethanol production in India. Now, molasses and ethanol are byproducts produced from sugarcane, and by increasing their production in India, it would indirectly help the sugarcane farmers. Now, the author in this article has raised various concerns with regard to the recent steps taken by the Government of India to support the sugarcane farmers. Now, according to the author, the amount of money that is due to farmers from sugar mills is roughly at 22,000 crore, wherein the package approved is only of 7,000 crore. And apart from this, sugar prices have also dropped from an average of rupees 37 a kg in the previous season to about 26 rupees in the current season. And the bailout package that has been promised by the Government of India assures to pay only rupees 29 a kg, which according to the sugar mills is below their production cost of rupees 35 a kg. Now, apart from this, the rating agency CRISIL has also said that the package will at best will only help about 40% of the outstanding amount due to sugarcane farmers, wherein the outstanding amount is roughly at 22,000 crore, while the approved package is of around 7,000 crore. And lastly, according to the author, these efforts given by the Government of India are temporary in nature and fail to address the structural flaws that exist in the sugarcane industry. Now, hopefully, you have understood the critique given by the author with regards to the recent steps taken by the Government of India to aid the sugarcane farmers. Now, with regards to your UPSC syllabus, this article and the explanation given in this section would be placed in GS Paper 3 in the Economic Development section, and within the subsection, issues related to indirect farm subsidies and minimum support prices. And now with this, we come to an end in the analysis of today's paper. Now we move on to the question for today.